Picture this. It's 1943, and you're a Japanese pilot who's been dominating the Pacific skies for 2 years. Suddenly, a massive blue monster with bent wings screams past you at impossible speed, unleashing a storm of bullets before vanishing into the clouds. Your hands are shaking, your squadron is scattered, and for the first time in this war, you're genuinely terrified. That monster? The F4U Corsair. And today, we're diving into classified Japanese documents to reveal what they really thought about America's most feared fighter and why their secret reports paint a picture of growing terror that would ultimately break the spirit of the world's most elite pilots. But here's the shocking part. Japan initially dismissed the Corsair as a failure. They were dead wrong, and that mistake would haunt them until surrender. When the F4U Corsair first touched down in Pacific Theater airstrips in early 1943, it didn't arrive with fanfare. In fact, even American crews weren't sure what to make of this bent-winged beast. Its design looked almost alien. Those distinctive inverted gull wings, the massive nose housing a propeller bigger than most fighter planes entirely, and a cockpit that sat so far back that pilots joked they needed periscopes to see forward. Japanese intelligence officers, monitoring from hidden observation posts, initially saw opportunity in America's apparent design disaster. Early reports from Tokyo's Naval Analysis Division, documents that remained classified until the 1990s, actually mocked the Corsair's appearance. One analyst wrote, and I quote, "The Americans have created a fighter that looks like it was assembled from spare bomber parts. This crude design suggests panic in their aviation industry." They couldn't have been more wrong. What Japanese engineers failed to recognize was that every flaw they observed was actually revolutionary engineering. Those bent wings? They weren't aesthetic choices. They were the solution to fitting the largest, most powerful propeller ever mounted on a Navy fighter. That massive nose. It housed the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, more power than anything Japan had ever put in the air. But here's what made this even more shocking. The Americans had been systematically studying Japanese aviation technology for years before the Corsair ever took flight. The intelligence war had begun long before Pearl Harbor. In 1940, the Imperial Japanese Navy revealed the world's most advanced carrier-based fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M-0. With its incredible 12-to-1 kill ratio in early combat operations, legendary range, and unmatched maneuverability, it was a flying samurai sword. The Zero embodied the Japanese principles of Bushido, honor, elegance, and individual skill, determining victory. As early as 1940, during the Second Sino-Japanese War, Chinese forces had recovered intact Zero fighters that had been forced down or crashed. The first major intelligence breakthrough came in September 1940, when a team including Western volunteers examined a largely intact A6M2 that had fallen near Funan Island. Their detailed technical report made its way to Washington, providing the first glimpse into Japanese fighter capabilities. Even more significant was the A6M2-21 that made a forced landing near Tietzan Airfield in February 1941. 10 months before Pearl Harbor, Chinese forces shot the pilot before he could destroy his aircraft, repaired the fuel system, and began extensive flight testing. The analysis team, which included engineer Gerhard Neumann, compiled an exhaustive illustrated report that was shipped directly to U.S. intelligence. While impressed with the aircraft's build quality, the team noted performance limitations that would prove crucial, though they initially attributed some of these to using lower octane fuel than the Zero's engine required. This early intelligence gave American designers nearly 2 years to understand what they would be facing and what kind of fighter would be needed to counter it. Then came the Akutan breakthrough. In June 1942, Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga's emergency landing attempt had ended tragically with his death, but it provided the Allies with an even more complete specimen, a nearly intact Zero to study, test, and dissect under controlled conditions. American test pilots who flew the recovered Akutan Zero discovered both its brilliance and its fatal flaws. They found an aircraft built like a fine watch, flush rivets, incredible attention to detail, a fuselage and wings constructed as one piece for maximum structural strength. At 5,200 pounds fully loaded, it was nearly 3,000 pounds lighter than the American F4F Wildcat, giving it unmatched agility. But the testing also revealed critical vulnerabilities that would prove decisive. The Zero's controls became dangerously stiff above 216 miles per hour, making high-speed maneuvers impossible. It couldn't roll to the right as quickly as it could to the left, an asymmetry that could be exploited. Most critically, it had virtually no pilot protection, no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no bulletproof glass. The Corsair's specifications read like science fiction to Japanese analysts accustomed to their nimble but lightly built fighters. Top speed, 446 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than their beloved Zero. Dive speed, over 500 miles per hour, 6.50 caliber machine guns, armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks. This represented the perfect counter to everything American test pilots had learned from the captured Akutan Zero. Where the Zero became uncontrollable above 216 miles per hour, the Corsair excelled at high speeds. Where the Zero had no pilot protection, the Corsair was armored like a flying tank. Where the Zero couldn't roll quickly to the right, the Corsair could maneuver in any direction at any speed. The Americans had essentially custom-built the Zero's natural predator. But numbers on paper were one thing. What happened when this ungainly American fighter met Japan's finest pilots in actual combat would shatter every assumption Tokyo had made. Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated aces with over 60 confirmed kills, would later describe his first encounter with a Corsair squadron as the moment I understood the war had changed forever. Flying his trusted Mitsubishi Zero over Bougainville in late 1943, Sakai expected another routine interception of lumbering American bombers. Instead, he found himself facing something that defied everything Japanese pilots had learned about air combat. The Corsairs didn't try to outturn the Zeros. They didn't need to. They attacked from altitude with devastating speed, unleashed their 6.50 caliber machine guns in murderous passes, then climbed away before the lighter Japanese fighters could respond. They fought like no honorable pilot should fight, Sakai later recalled in captured interrogation transcripts, but they fought effectively. This wasn't the graceful aerial ballet that Japanese pilots had mastered. This was something new, something brutal. Industrial warfare taken to the sky. But perhaps nothing terrified Japanese pilots more than the Corsair's distinctive sound. The aircraft's unique engine intake design created an eerie whistle as it dove, a sound that would earn it the nickname Whistling Death among both American Marines and the Japanese pilots who feared it. Declassified reports from Japanese air bases at Rabaul described pilots physically flinching when they heard that sound, even during training exercises. One base commander wrote, "The psychological effect of the American fighter's approach is undermining pilot confidence. Some veterans refuse to engage when they hear the whistle." This wasn't just about superior performance specifications. The Corsair was conducting psychological warfare, and it was winning. What Japanese commanders failed to grasp initially was that the Corsair represented a complete departure from traditional fighter doctrine. While the Zero had been designed for the elegant one-on-one duels that characterized early Pacific air combat, the Corsair was built for something far more devastating: coordinated squadron attacks that prioritized overwhelming firepower over individual skill. Here's where the story takes a fascinating turn that Japanese naval intelligence never saw coming, despite all their careful analysis of American fighter development. In late 1943, Tokyo's strategic planners believed they had the Corsair figured out through careful observation and intercepted communications. Their analysis was simple. This temperamental fighter was clearly land-based only. Its long nose and stiff landing gear made carrier operations impossible, limiting its deployment range and strategic impact. They were so confident in this assessment that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's replacement, Admiral Mineichi Koga, actually dismissed Corsair threats in several operational briefings. "The bent-wing fighter cannot follow us to sea," he reportedly told his staff. "We control the waters. They control only the mud strips." This strategic miscalculation would prove catastrophic, and it revealed a fundamental flaw in Japanese intelligence gathering. They were analyzing American capabilities through the lens of their own limitations. Japanese carriers operated with smaller, lighter aircraft designed for specific roles. The idea that Americans would brute force engineer a heavy, powerful fighter onto carrier decks seemed impossible, because it would have been impossible for them. While Japanese intelligence focused on the Corsair's apparent carrier limitations, they completely missed what was happening on islands like Bougainville, Peleliu, and later Iwo Jima. Marine Corsair squadrons were establishing forward operating bases closer and closer to Japanese strongholds, extending their effective range far beyond what Tokyo had calculated. Operating from rough, muddy airstrips carved out of jungle and coral, these Marine units were proving that the Corsair didn't need pristine carrier decks to be devastatingly effective. Captain Kenneth Walsh, who would become the first Corsair ace, later described these early island operations. "We were flying off strips that would make a carrier deck look luxurious." But the Corsair didn't care. It was built like a truck. You could slam it down on any surface, and it would bounce back up ready to fight. But the real shock came in late 1944, when the U.S. Navy finally solved the Corsair's carrier landing problems through a combination of design modifications and improved pilot training techniques. Suddenly, the fighter that couldn't land on ships was launching from aircraft carriers throughout the Pacific Fleet. Japanese lookouts who had grown accustomed to identifying distant American carrier groups by their aircraft types were suddenly reporting impossible sightings. Corsairs rising from the decks of ships that were supposed to carry only Hellcats and Wildcats. The Corsair represented industrial might applied to aerial warfare. It didn't need to be elegant, it needed to be effective. It didn't prioritize pilot honor, it prioritized pilot survival. And most importantly, it wasn't designed for individual duels. It was engineered for systematic destruction of enemy air power. Faced with the Corsair's complete dominance, Japanese Aviation Command attempted several increasingly desperate tactical adaptations. They developed new formations designed to exploit what they believed was the Corsair's poor turning ability, formations that proved useless against pilots who had no intention of turning. They trained pilots in vertical combat techniques that required performance capabilities their aircraft simply didn't possess. Most desperately, they even experimented with ramming attacks, essentially kamikaze tactics applied to conventional fighters. These suicide intercepts were meant to trade one Japanese pilot for one American aircraft, but even these failed as Corsair pilots learned to detect and avoid the ramming attempts. Major Roy Bruce, an Allied intelligence officer who analyzed captured Japanese training documents, noted the futility of these efforts. They were trying to adapt World War I dogfighting techniques to counter a World War III fighter. It was like bringing swords to a machine gun battle, except they kept sharpening the swords instead of recognizing they needed different weapons entirely. The most telling evidence of Japanese desperation came in the form of technical intelligence reports that recommended avoiding Corsair engagements entirely unless numerical superiority exceeded 5-1. Even then, the reports advised immediate disengagement if the attack failed within the first 30 seconds. By 1944, as Japan's situation grew increasingly desperate, the Corsair would face its most tragic test, the kamikaze attacks. These suicide missions represented Japan's ultimate acknowledgement that conventional air combat was no longer viable against Allied technology. But even here, the Corsair proved devastatingly effective. Flying combat air patrol over Allied fleets, Corsair squadrons became the first line of defense against kamikaze waves. The results were grimly spectacular. During the Battle of Okinawa, Marine Major John Smith recorded in his flight log, "Intercepted 12 bogies inbound to the fleet, splashed 11 before they got within 5 miles of our ships. The 12th turned back. Even the kamikazes fear the bent-winged bird." Japanese archives reveal the psychological impact this had on suicide pilots, men supposedly beyond fear. Flight Officer Tadamasa Itatsu, whose kamikaze mission was aborted after encountering Corsairs, wrote in his final letter home, "Even in death, we cannot escape the blue demons. They hunt us from the clouds like kami gods of war." The combat statistics tell a story of complete air superiority reversal. In early 1943, Japanese fighters still maintained roughly equal exchange rates with Allied aircraft. By late 1944, Corsair squadrons were achieving kill ratios that seemed almost impossible. Colonel William Guise, commander of Marine Aircraft Group 31, observed something even more significant. We weren't just winning air battles anymore, we were preventing them entirely. Japanese formations would turn back at the sight of our Corsairs. That's not combat, that's psychological domination. Something unprecedented was happening in Japanese aviation circles. Veteran pilots, men who had survived years of brutal Pacific air combat, were requesting transfers away from fighter squadrons. Others were developing what military physicians would later recognize as combat stress reactions, but which Japanese command at the time interpreted as cowardice. The breaking point came during the Philippines campaign. Lieutenant Tetsuzo Iwamoto, Japan's second highest scoring ace with 80 confirmed kills, encountered a Corsair formation over Luzon and made a decision that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. He turned away without engaging. In his post-war interview with American interrogators, Iwamoto explained, "I had survived 2 years of war by understanding my enemies. But the Corsair, it was not an enemy to understand. It was a force of nature to avoid." As 1945 progressed, Japan faced a nightmare scenario that their early dismissal of the Corsair had helped create. While they struggled to maintain production of increasingly obsolete fighters using inferior materials and undertrained workers, American factories were churning out Corsairs at an unprecedented rate. The Chance Vought plant in Stratford, Connecticut, was producing nearly 400 Corsairs per month by war's end. Meanwhile, Japan's entire aircraft production had collapsed to fewer than 500 fighters of all types per month, and most of these were flown by pilots with less than 50 hours of flight training, compared to American pilots who arrived in theater with 300-plus hours of training. Lieutenant General Curtis LeMay, who would later oversee the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, observed this disparity with clinical precision. We're not just outfighting them anymore. We're outproducing them at a rate that makes resistance mathematically impossible. Every Corsair we lose, we replace with 3 more. Every pilot they lose is irreplaceable. This industrial dominance meant that by 1945, some Japanese pilots were facing Corsairs flown by Americans who had more flight hours in type than the Japanese pilots had total flight hours. The experience gap had become as devastating as the technology gap. Perhaps no document captures Japan's complete psychological defeat better than a report filed by Captain Yasuo Kuwahara of the 343rd Air Group in April 1945. Writing just months before surrender, he observed, "Our new pilots see the bent wings and hear the whistle, and they are defeated before the first shot is fired. This is not the fault of their training or their courage. This is the fault of fighting something that cannot be fought with the spirit alone." The war's final months produced some of the most one-sided aerial encounters in military history. During the April 1945 Operation Tengo, Japan's desperate attempt to break the Okinawa siege, Corsair squadrons intercepted the massive Kamikaze waves with devastating efficiency. Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa, one of the few Kamikaze pilots to survive his mission, his plane was too damaged to reach the target, wrote in his recovered diary, "I saw the blue wings diving from the sun, and I knew I would never reach the ships." Even in choosing to die, we cannot escape their shadows. The ultimate irony, from mockery to mastery. The greatest irony of the Corsair story lies in Japan's initial assessment versus the final reality. Those early 1943 intelligence reports that mocked the Corsair's crude design and panic engineering would be filed alongside surrender documents just 2 years later. Air Marshal Torishiro Kawabe, one of the few high-ranking Japanese aviation officials to survive the war, was asked in 1946 about Japan's greatest strategic miscalculation. His answer was immediate. "We underestimated American engineering because it was different from ours. We prized elegance, they prized effectiveness. We built art, they built weapons. The Corsair taught us that in war, ugly and effective beats beautiful and fragile every time." On the American side, the recognition of this transformation was equally profound. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces, would later write, "The Corsair didn't just win battles. It demonstrated that American industrial might could reimagine the very nature of aerial warfare. We didn't just build a better fighter, we built a philosophy of air power that made traditional dogfighting obsolete." While Japan perfected the graceful art of agile dogfighting, creating aircraft that were truly beautiful to watch in flight, America was pioneering the brutal science of industrial air warfare. While Japanese engineers pursued aesthetic elegance and honored tradition, American designers embraced raw effectiveness and discarded conventional wisdom entirely. The result wasn't just a better fighter plane, it was a complete redefinition of what air combat could and should be. Today, when military historians study the Pacific Air War, they often point to dramatic battles like Midway or the Guadalcanal campaign as the decisive turning points. But the real turning point might have been far more subtle. The moment Japanese pilots first heard that distinctive Corsair whistle and realized they were facing something entirely beyond their understanding and preparation. That sound represented more than just another aircraft approaching. It was the audio signature of American industrial might, technological innovation, and completely revolutionary strategic thinking converging into something unstoppable. It was quite literally the sound of the future arriving ahead of schedule and destroying the established order. Thanks for watching, and remember, the next time someone tells you something can't be done because that's not how we do things, think of the Corsair. Innovation doesn't ask permission, and the future doesn't wait for anyone to catch up. We'll see you in the skies next time.